Hi all. Thought I'd start with kind of the big picture view today. Hope it doesn't scare you. Oogity booty, oogity booty. But anyway, one of the things I was on a lecture, or really a video call, I should say, with a bunch of other colleagues earlier today. It was interesting to know how many of them had cats walking through they're walking by their camera when they got started. But one of the things several of my colleagues mentioned is that if I'm doing a lecture and you have questions, feel free to send me an email and I'll try and deal with it with a quick email response, or I'll try and cover it in the subsequent video that I make. So please, get in contact with me. Now, the other thing my wife frequently tells me is that I have this habit sometimes of when I'm lecturing, I like to close my eyes. And I'm told there's a drinking game that every time I close my eyes for 3 seconds, people have another drink. I don't know if that's true or not. But anyway, let's return to the subject at hand. I want to start talking about Chapter 24. There'll be several video lectures on Chapter 24, Aggregate Supply and Aggregate Demand. So when we look at what's going on in the text, what we see is that there are really four goals in the macro economy. We've talked about ways of measuring several of these goals. So what I'm trying to say here is one of the things we're trying to accomplish with our economy is to grow GDP, to have more that we can have for people to have. And we can measure that by real GDP. And we talked about how productivity influences what it is that we're able to produce. So that's one of our goals. And this is what we put on our dashboard. We also try to have low unemployment. Jobs are really important, not just for the money, but for a sense of self-worth, community. Employment is very important. So we measure that with employment. We talked about that employment ratio. We also measure that with the unemployment rate, something that sadly is going to be going up quite a bit. We might have a 1-month record for a jump in unemployment when the figures come out in early May. We also want low inflation. You probably watched that video about what was happening in Zimbabwe, what's been happening in Venezuela. It can destroy the fabric of a country. So we measure that with the Consumer Price Index and inflation. And the fourth and last goal is a sustainable balance of trade, what we trade with other nations. We measure that with the trade deficit, but we haven't discussed that yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. So I want to construct a model here to explain what goes on in the macroeconomy. It's the same one that you see in your text. So let's say we take all the goods in the economy. We look at pop, once again, soda for those of you from outside the Midwest. Haircuts, Lord knows I can really use one. Tractors, tuna fish, my cats made me put that one in there. And we look at all the goods in the economy. We're looking at supply first, aggregate supply, and we're just starting out with individual supply curves. And what we can do is we can add them up. The word aggregate or aggregate means to just add things up. So what we see is we add up all these individual supply curves and we get an added up, that is an aggregated supply curve. But wait a second. If we add up all the supply curves, what can we use for price and quantity? Well, for the price, we can use a price index. I like to call it a price index. The book likes to call it a price level. But the idea here is that what we're saying here is, instead of just looking at the price of one good, like pop or tractors or haircuts, we add up the price of all goods, and we can use a price index to measure that. If we're going to talk about the quantity of pop, haircuts, tractors, and tuna fish, how can we measure the quantity of all the goods put together? We'll look at GDP. And when we use GDP, the best kind of GDP, the best measure is real GDP. So we're going to use, for our prices, a price index. For quantity, we're going to use real GDP. So this raises a question. Why would the aggregate supply curve slope upwards? And the answer is, if prices are higher, firms would want to offer more for sale. If you have a business, think of all the businesses. If all of a sudden people find out that the price that they can sell things for goes up, they're going to want to offer more for sale. Firms will work overtime. They'll open up, new stores. They'll try and order more products. If the prices are high, they're going to try and do that. And we assume the price of the inputs, in other words, what they're paying for labor and materials, stays constant, and the price here of what they can sell things for, what consumers pay, if that goes up, if you have a business and your workers have signed a contract, they're working for $10 an hour, and people really want more of your product, well, you'll hire more workers, you're willing to offer more for sale. They added up the aggregate supply curve. When prices of what you sell your things for are higher, when the price level is higher, then people are going to want to offer more goods for sale. Now, realistically, the added up, the aggregate supply curve is not a straight line. It kind of looks like this. And in fact, a much better diagram for what the added up, the aggregate supply curve can be found in your textbook. Now, I have a somewhat different edition of the book. It's in chapter 24 of your book. So notice what this says. We're going to come back to potential GDP in just a minute. But if the economy is way below capacity, picture a situation where factories are idle, where stores don't have much business. If prices go up just a little bit, people are willing to offer a lot more for sale. And if prices go up again, they're willing to offer even more for sale. So when prices are really low, that's when you have a lot of excess capacity in your factory. Prices go up a little, wow, you're willing to add 1,000 more. The economy will add 1,000 more to real GDP. But, eventually you find it harder and harder to add more production. Picture, if you will, if you're running a factory with 2 shifts and prices go up a little bit, you're going to say, wait, I'm not going to add a 3rd shift. I'm going to have to recruit all these new workers. I'm going to have to raise wages to get people to work at night. You'll have to give me a lot more money for me to just add a little bit to what I'm offering for sale. But wait a second. What's this thing called potential GDP? You can see it's a straight line here. What we're saying here is this is what is the potential that GDP could be at. Now, when we use the term potential GDP, this is the maximum quantity an economy can produce. I know I shouldn't have capitalized the M in maximum. Think about this, however, as something that's sustainable. It's not a sprint. What I mean by this is the following. This is a level of GDP that the economy can sustain. It can keep on doing this. Sometimes you can picture a situation where, maybe somebody's going to offer you a really, large amount of money. But, maybe they'll offer you $25 an hour and you say, hey, I'm going to work 10, 12 hours a day. But eventually you find out if you're working 80, 90 hours a week, you're going to say, man, I can't sustain that. Potential GDP, that's a pace. If any of you are runners or bicyclists, it's a pace that's sustainable. But sometimes you can sprint. For those of you that ran cross country, you can think about this, that, this represents a sustainable pace, but sometimes you can sprint for a little bit, but you can't sprint the entire race. This is a sustainable level. Now, it's also called full employment. Full employment, as we said when we talked about unemployment, doesn't mean that everyone has a job. It's just a level where the only thing we have is, wait, there's, which 2 types of employment still exist at full employment? I hope you said structural unemployment and cyclical. There's always some unemployment, even when the economy is at its potential. Sometimes, however, temporarily, let's say the nation goes to war and the government demands a lot of goods and services, temporarily we can exceed that level. And we call this level of potential GDP full employment. Now, What does potential GDP depend on? The answer is it depends on those things that we talked about before when we talked about what determines what an economy can produce. One of it's labor. How many people do we have in the economy? How many people can work? Also, what's the level of human capital, their skills, their training? That influences what the economy has the potential to produce. Physical capital, the machinery. What is the equipment that we have in the economy? Technology. How do we put our labor and human capital and physical capital together? What's the technology that enables us to do that? Natural resources. If you have good land or you have oil, if you have good weather, you can have a higher potential GDP. And finally, the government institutions, the laws, the courts, the things that keep the economy going, a good government, an honest government. And this is what's going to determine what the potential GDP is going to be in a nation. Sometimes we can go beyond this temporarily. We can, in fact, sprint. So what we see here is the aggregate, the added up supply curve. And it says, look, if we're far away from our potential, if the factories are idle and people are unemployed, it doesn't take much of a price increase for people to offer a lot more for sale. But once we really find out the factories are operating at capacity, maybe people will delay maintenance. Maybe people will work 16 hours a day. But going past the potential GDP, it's not sustainable. Okay. Now, anytime you have questions about this or any other lecture or the text or what's going on in the course, contact that fellow over there. He really does enjoy hearing from you. Okay, take care, stay well, and be back with a lecture on aggregate demand soon.